Okay, welcome everybody. It's 1:15 p.m., so I'm going to get started. I assume some people will trickle in. Remember, we are in webinar mode, so you can pose your questions in the chat box, and I'll keep peeking at them to see if there's any questions that need to be answered. But presumably, I will hold them until the end so that we can cover them in question mode at the end. Sound okay? Okay, so let me share my slides with you. And this is going to be a little bit different of a format than our typical neurofeedback expert niche clientele workshop webinars that we usually do together at this time, because we're talking about screen time effects this month in preparation for next month, when it is National Screen-Free Week, which you can imagine how excited my 6 children are about that week. They've already proclaimed to me that there's no way they're going screen-free. They are wrong. They will be going screen-free. I don't know if, for my own sanity, if I'll be able to keep them from electronics. They're teenagers primarily for the entire week, but we're going to give it a whirl. But so let's start talking about electronics. And if you have been in practice as a neurofeedback practitioner for any amount of time, you know that people ask this question all the time, which is half the reason I talk about it. The other half is because it's such cool information and it really impacts all of our lives. Who do you know that's not on their phone or their iPad or in front of a computer most of their time? Not many people. So that's why I've entitled it Save Your Child's Brain from Electronics for today. But we're going to talk about reversing screen time effects. And you'll see the majority of this presentation is about what screen time will do to us if we continue to absorb screens as much as we do. And I will tone this aspect down when I present it to prospective patients, but for your sake, I want you to know that screen time is associated with many of the challenges that people are going to come into you to see you for. So that's a real big takeaway for you all today as neurofeedback experts. Okay, so how can screens affect our life, the consequences? And this is all based on science, so if you know me, you know the science is very important to me. Studies have shown in all of the following, and those are research scientific studies, that there has been an increase in all of these problems over the course of the last, really they've been looking at it in the last 30 years or so, but a lot of the studies are very recent. So there's an increase in anxiety, and we're going to talk about that and why in just a minute. OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, ADHD, 800% increase between 1980 and 2007, which that's the last comparative longitudinal study that I've looked at. And I'm not sure if recent data over the long haul is out because I haven't looked at it in the last year or so. But I mean, either way, we know ADHD is going up even more since 2007. So diagnoses are off the charts. Sensory overload, sensory processing disorder, and just overload from being constantly plugged in. And we're going to talk about what electronics do to the brain. Addictions. So there's an increase in email addiction, and now with Instagram and Snapchat, social media addiction. The internet provides a springboard. So using electronics provides a springboard for addictions that have been around for a very long time, but now the internet just makes them so accessible, and they're worse than ever. So for example, gambling, and we know gambling can be done on iPads. My parents have gambling on their iPad, which is weird. Not that they're big gamblers, but they love it. They think it's the most fun thing ever, and they're 79. Porn is so much more accessible than it's been in the past. So there's websites that call it the new drug, and it's just at one's fingertips, literally. Shopping, you can purchase and overspend from your phone. So all these other challenges that have been around for a long time are shooting through the roof because people can now access their addiction on their phone. Social problems, and this I see in my own life. And actually, when I was at the university, I had a colleague and I were going to, but then I left being there full time. We were going to do a research study on the social implications of being always plugged in. I mean, we see it in commercials or TV and you see it in your life where kids don't even look up from their phone. They cross the street without ever looking. They are buried in their phones, which means they are no longer saying hello to people. They're no longer making eye contact with people. We have to literally teach our children, who are pretty well regulated, to make eye contact with us and with people frequently, because their heads are used to being buried in their phone, and it is a problem. And then what happens is we have a lot of inappropriate behaviors that are happening. And without really getting into it too in depth in this intro slide, and you can just imagine this, and again, I want you to be able to speak to your patients about this, which is why I'm going to digress for a second, is that inappropriate behaviors, because before, young children would have to learn how to self-regulate themselves in different situations. Young children to older children. And in so many families now, instead of having to learn how to self-regulate, kids are given an electronic in these different situations. So they're just artificially regulating or making their way through a situation that before they would have to learn how to control themselves. So some examples might be at restaurants. You see little guys just plugged into iPads while families eat, or actually see entire families plugged into their phones and iPads while they're out at the restaurant. When we take our troops out, and there's 8 of us, when we go out for dinner, even at home, there are no screens during meals ever. So yeah, it can be a little painful because sometimes we run into sibling dynamics, but it's important for them to learn how to sit at a table and enjoy a meal together. Same thing in the car. Besides long trips where it's absolutely necessary for my sake, my kids are not allowed to plug themselves into electronics when they're in the car. They have to engage with each other and with me. So instead, many families are just plugging kids in at church. You know, when I was young, I'd have to go to church every Sunday and sit through church. I'd have to learn how to be quiet and just sit there through a thing that I did not find entertaining. And that taught me for 1 hour at a time to regulate myself in boring situations, and that is not happening. So it's creating a ton of inappropriate behaviors, and it's creating kids that don't know how to self-regulate. Depression. So depression is through the roof. And if I've talked with any of you recently, I'm reading a few books that quote the incidence of depression and how it is skyrocketing, even though prescription medications to combat depression are at an all-time high. That means we are in crisis, and we already knew that. We're in crisis with anxiety and depression and sleep problems. So many people who come into me say, I can't sleep. But then when you ask that person how they use their electronics or balance their electronics, they're like, what do you mean? And they're just on their phone or their iPad or their computer right up until the minute they go to bed. And I'm going to show you why that's a terrible idea. Okay, so the essence of what we're talking about is people's brains are becoming wired and tired. And I borrow this term, electronic screen syndrome, and the idea of wired and tired from Victoria Dunkley, who's a psychiatrist. If you look her up, or if you look up wired and tired, or if you look up electronic screen syndrome, she's coining that term very successfully, and I hugely respect her work. What happens in the brain, she doesn't talk about this at all. She just talks about the more kids or adults use electronics, their brains are becoming wired and tired. And I am here to show you what's happening in the brain. So this is a brain map, and if you're using a different system, it's easy to be able to coordinate what you see in this map versus what you have, and I'm going to tell you in just a second. But what a wired brain is excessive use of high beta, of that extra fast processing speed. It is a brain that's going a mile a minute. So you'll see on the right-hand side, high beta is all red. On this mapping system, what you want to see, and this is not my mapping system, I'm borrowing this, what you want to see is all green. On this particular system, it's all green, would be a regulated brain. Red means that it's 3 levels too high of use of high beta, that extra fast processing speed, which means that brain is wired. If you use a clear mind or a brain core system, what this would look like is all red areas on your brain map. Okay, so wired then also goes down on our continuum. So just to remind you how your brain maps work, hopefully you know this. High beta is extra fast speed. Beta is fast processing speed, but when we see yellow or orange or red, it means that that fast speed is being used too much also. Alpha is that medium speed for chill mode, and in this case, we can see it's pretty good. Theta is slow speed. It's implicated in ADD and ADHD, but it means tired also, so it means slowing of the brain. And delta is slowing of the brain. It's associated with fatigue, with adrenal fatigue, with inflammation, with kind of blowout or burnout of the brain. So when we see red in high beta and red in delta, that's a wired and a tired brain. And we're going to think about how an ADHD brain and an anxiety brain might be impacted by excessive use of electronics. So just stay with me for a minute and then we'll move on to the next slide. If someone has anxiety and they come into your neurofeedback expert practice, what are you going to see on their brain map? You're going to see excessive use of high beta in the first place. So you may see a brain map that has red in high beta, or hopefully if they know they have symptoms of anxiety, it's only at the yellow to orange levels. But they have too much high beta in the first place. Then the longer and longer they sit in front of a screen, the more and more and more high beta is going up because they're wiring their brain even more. So an anxiety brain is more at risk for being impacted by electronics than a brain that is using speed typically. The same thing applies for people with ADD or ADHD. So you can see how theta has excessive use, too much slowing. The longer a person uses their electronics, we're going to see an increase in theta and an increase in delta. We're going to see more and more slowing. That's the tired portion. So a person with ADD or ADHD is at much larger, huge risk for having a wired and tired brain when they use electronics. Now, the irony of the situation is electronics are going to feel the best to brains that either run anxious or have ADD. It's providing the stimulation that the brain wants. So not only are they more at risk, they're more at risk for wanting to use it. Okay, so moving on, and hopefully you understand how electronics wire and tire the brain, looking at that brain map. But what happens is when the brain's wired and tired, so I use the analogy in my office at Lee Brain Spine all the time, stay up for 2 days. That and then rush around like a maniac. That's a tired brain that's wired. Rush around and be late. Wake up late, right? Stay up for 2 days and then go to an appointment late. So your brain will be firing extra fast because you're rushing, and it'll be firing extra slow because you're exhausted. And if you've ever done that, I think all of us have probably done that at one point in life. If you've ever done that, then you know how terrible that feels and how it creates irritability. It creates outbursts in children. It creates tantrums. It is a very dysregulated brain pattern, which creates very dysregulated behaviors. So what happens is the light, and we talk about how it wires and tires the brain, but let's talk about how. The light ramps up the energy in the brain. I'm going to tell you how in just 1 second. And there's cognitive stimulation by the way that they're engaging with their electronics also. Okay, so light. Electronics resonate at 60 hertz in the United States, 50 hertz European. So if you are in front of a screen, your brain will attune, proven by science, it will attune with your screen that's resonating at 60 hertz. So what that means is, let's say I'm perfectly regulated and I'm calm and I'm focused right now. My brain is running at 15 hertz. So I'm here and I'm working and I'm at 15 hertz. The longer I sit in front of the screen, my brain will start to go faster and faster and faster just because of the light stimulation. So it'll go to 17 hertz. Then if I sit here longer, it'll go to 25 hertz. Then it'll go to 30. And so what's happening is my brain is going from alpha and low beta to high beta. because it's attuning to the light stimulation. And computers use blue light, and we're going to talk about one thing you can do at the end and that you can tell your patients to do that they love, by the way, at the end. But what you want to do is reduce the effects of blue light stimulation. And there's a couple ways we can do that, and I'll tell you in a few minutes. Now, beyond the electronic stimulation due to the light on a physiological level, there's cognitive stimulation that ramps up the energy in the brain also. So most times when people are on electronics, especially young people, it's not because they're writing a dissertation, it's because they're using Instagram. My children are on Instagram all the time. Don't get me wrong, I think it's cool, but I'm not on it that much. My kids are on it. They will scroll. You'll see them, they're going scroll, 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 scroll. When they're scrolling like that, they are taking in everybody else's life at a rapid rate and liking it and hitting the hearts so that they're liking what they see for people. They're barely processing it, but the fact that they're rushing through it is ramping up the energy in their brain. I just had a consultation in the office on Monday, and this kiddo, I think he's 17, poor kid, has significant tic disorder, so he is no longer able to go to school because it's very loud. It's a vocal oral tic, very loud. Can't go to school anymore because it's too disruptive. His brain's on fire, poor kid, and we need to do a map, see exactly what we can do for him. But clearly it's on fire, but he loves to play Fortnite, so he spends tons of his time in front of his video game, and he knows he's addicted to it, but he says he's so successful at it. It's like the only thing he's good at. So those are his words. So he spends lots and lots of time. And even in the consultation, which I try not to give too many tips to people during a consultation, I told him he's got to break up the amount of time he's spending on electronics if he wants these tics to go away. So the cognitive stimulation is a piece too. And that goes back to emails too. So one trigger for me, which generally I'm in pretty good shape, but if I'm rushing or if I'm too busy or if something's unhinging a little in my life, I'll find myself wanting to check my emails at the end of the night, which I never do. When I'm done for the evening, I don't ever check my phone at all, actually. So when I feel the need to check my email, even though there's nothing coming in, I know that I'm running hot and I need to chill myself out and put some of my healthy practices into place. So what happens at the physiological level is it's actually stimulating excessive firing of the brain cells, which then increases the electrical energy frequency in the brain. So it's like, I always call it an overactive or a chaotic pattern. We have excessive firing of the cells, raising the energy, and it can cause fight or flight. So many times when people ramp up this energy in their brain, they become hypervigilant because of this constant scrolling for information that they're doing. So what happens is if your nervous system's in a hypervigilant state at length, it will get exhausted and it poops out, and that's where the fatigue sets in, the wired and the tired. And there's Dr. Victoria Dunkley's name. So if you want to look up her work, it's awesome. You'll really like it. Okay, so thinking about OCD, I've already started to talk about this just a little bit, but the feeling, so you know how I said that if I feel like I need to check my email, that's a compulsion, and I'm completely aware of that, and I don't generally have any compulsions. I don't feel the need to do something. So if I feel the need to do something, it's because my brain is running hot. Compulsions come out of, usually it's this anterior cingulate gyrus where it's running too hot and it's like a hamster on a wheel that gives you a thought and won't let you go, won't it let it go. So then the key to success is bringing that energy down, which electronics does not have a role in unless you're using neurofeedback, of course. So the compulsions that are brought on now by electronics is constant checking of messages. And, if you just think about it logically, you check for messages or on Instagram to see if someone liked your post. If you have a message, your brain gets this serotonin dump that makes you feel good and validated. That is now what is being created by electronics. So you check it and you've got a message, serotonin. So it's actually creating this feedback loop, and it's creating a dysregulated reward system in the brain because you check your phone and you get rewarded by having a message, even if it's from Best Buy, you know. So just the idea that you have a message creates that positive feedback loop. Messages from people you actually care about creates even more of that reward system. Excessive texting, so the constant being available to people, which I think is, obviously it's a beneficial thing, but also it's a double-edged sword, because you don't need to be available to people 24/7, but excessive texting. So, you know, my kids, again, not to keep talking about them, but they're an example of typical kids, and it becomes so much worse for dysregulated kids. They are constantly texting everybody. Being in group texts is social, so it becomes a really fun thing, but it also becomes addictive. Wanting to get back to video games, can't stop thinking about it. That's a compulsion. So I only have one kiddo who really loves to play video games, and I really moderate his video game use. But I can feel it on him when he's not engaging in his life, because he's just thinking about getting back to his video game. And when I can see he's at that point, he gets a washout from the video game altogether. So I can engage him back in life, because I don't want him to have these compulsive feelings about needing to get back to his video game. And, you know, even when it's moderated, people can have that compulsions. And social media use, I've already been talking about. And all of this is validated by a study from the University of Arkansas showing that these OCD behaviors are going up. And what that's going to create is more people in this world that have this excessively high brain pattern. So we're going to talk more. We got to go through these quickly. We're going to run out of time. ADHD puts the brain into the mode where it needs, so the ADHD brain is running slow. It is a brain that is trying to fall asleep. So for the person to be able to stay awake and stay engaged, it is a mode that it needs constant high rate of stimulation. So that's why I said to you, electronics serve that need for a person with ADHD. So they're much more at risk for electronic screen syndrome or negative impact because of screens, because they crave it. It gives them exactly what they want. So, for example, movies even do this. And I'm very cognizant of this, and I'll share with you one of my little tricks. But currently, TV and movies that are being produced right now in this day and age have many, many, many screenshots per second. If you watch shows even from 10 or 15 years ago, but especially from 20, 25 years ago, 25 years ago, it was like watching a play, but on your television. So you're watching these really long scenes of people interacting. Now it's screenshot change, you know, on and on and on. To be able to calm the brain down, watching something that has less screen changes can become very important. And the more screen changes that are in a show or a movie, the more stimulating it is for the brain. And honestly, producers are doing that on purpose. If you watch a commercial, the screen changes a million times within a commercial on purpose to stimulate the brain, from the electrical light changes and from the neurological stimulation of constantly looking for new features within the screen. And that's going to give the ADHD brain exactly what it wants. So what happens, and you'll hear a lot of prospective patients or patients tell you that it's very difficult for people with ADHD to exist in a world of low stimulation. So if you've heard me talk before on this subject of ADHD and anxiety, the purge and reboot is what you need to do. So purge the need for constant stimulation and reboot the system by encouraging that person to be able to sit doing nothing for longer and longer time frames. And I use the example of my children. When they get home from school, I've been making them for so long that they just do it themselves now. They all kind of lay around and sit around in the living room and just talk. Usually it's weird stuff about memes and things I don't understand at all, but they just talk amongst themselves about, you know, nothingness. And they'll do that for 15, 20 minutes before they move on to the next part of their day, which is not their homework, it's downtime. So my one kiddo, the one who loves video games, he now, because of the routine I've set up, is accustomed to going outside and playing basketball. My other son longboards, which is great for his brain. That creates transient hypofrontality, drops his frontal lobe out to give it a break. Some of my girls paint and create art. It's that downtime for their brain to bring the energy from school down before going into homework. So balancing how the brain is being used and creating pockets of low stimulation within the day. So when the kids say to me, I'm bored, I love it. I want you to be bored for a little while. It's good for your brain. And so I've already reminded you that ADHD is a dysregulated brain pattern that needs constant stimulation to stay engaged, and electronics are providing that. Okay, sensory overload. The screen changes and the screenshots creates sensory overload, high electrical energy, sensory overload. I don't know if you've ever experienced sensory overload. I am a person who does not like a lot of sensory input because it creates overstimulation of the brain, and because I've been training myself for so long, I think, to exist in that kind of alpha low beta state, I do not like going to the mall. So kids or even adults who need this constant stimulation, the mall is a great place for them because there's usually loud music, there's a lot of action happening. I don't love going to the mall because I have basically sensory overload right away. And electronics is contributing to higher and higher thresholds of sensory overload. And what I mean by that is if a threshold is higher and higher, that person is existing at these higher levels of stimulation. And so it's upsetting to the nervous system, but the person's not at DEFCON until that's very high levels of stimulation. So they may not react to it, but they're affected by it. And that's what I mean by that. It might feel good to them, but it's not good for them. And the consequences become that it is difficult for them to exist in the real world at a slower pace. And I mean, you see it in our society. So the brain feels the need to shift back and forth between activities, multitasking. So part of electronic use, and maybe some of you are guilty of this, is that I only work on one project at a time, and I will set time frames to do that, and then I work on the next project. I don't multitask. And again, if I have multiple web browsers open, that's another symptom or indicator to me that I'm out of sorts and that I'm too busy is always what's happening, because I've got too many of the browsers open and I have too much going on. So it's a constancy for intense stimulation. Okay, addictions. And again, what the addictions are, it's a chemical response that's happening within the brain that activates the brain's pleasure centers. So if you joined me or if you've watched the eating disorder webinar, then you know that what happens in addictions is it's an irregular reward system that is happening in the brain in terms of serotonin and dopamine. So the pleasure centers are activated when the person is engaged in those addictions, even though, again, it's bad for them. So it's not good for them, but it feels good to them. And it gives them the response that they want, but again, it's not good for them. So, and we've already kind of covered how that's happening. Okay, social skill deficits. So this is kind of thinking about the study that my colleague and I wanted to be able to look at more, but all these points are proven. And so if you see young people come into your office and they are lacking in these areas, science shows that these are some of the points that are really kind of tanking. Decrease in eye contact. So a lot, and the reason this is relevant to you, and I'm not sure, if you're working with families with children with learning challenges, but many times when people come in, it is social skills that they are most concerned about. I think people can get over, depending what their child's situation is, but can come to terms with different levels of achievement in terms of academics. But if their children can't interact with other adults and can't build friendships, that's cause for major alarm for them. So not being able to make eye contact because their heads are buried in their electronics is a major challenge that we're seeing in children and adolescents these days. Difficulty initiating conversation. So without electronics, and this was probably happened to you when you were growing up, if you were sitting there with someone else and there was nothing else to do, you would engage in conversation. You would initiate the conversation, and then you'd be able to have reciprocity in that conversation if an adult asked you a question. Now, with engagement in electronics, experience with all of these social skills is decreasing, which is making it so that young people don't have the experience to build upon so that they become better and better at these social skills. Small talk challenges, difficulty reading emotional expression because they're just not doing it. In my house, we joke because I give the kids a lot of dirty looks, and they'll joke now that they're giving me a clean look, but they have to actually be looking at me and engaging with me to be able to sense my dirty look. And obviously we're only kidding, but to be able to read my emotional expression and my cues and then be able to act on them. And with nonverbal cues also, you really need to be able to pay attention to people to be able to pick up on all of these things. We've already talked about self-regulation is decreased because electronics are used to soothe the self. And that is true for children and adults alike. Where adults, and I purposely don't do this. If I'm waiting, and of course I'm always working on this stuff, it's important to me. But if I take my children to get their haircuts, I just took 2 of them for haircuts the other day. They're getting their haircut, and I'm not buried in my phone. I just sit and chill. I use it actually as like a meditative time for my brain to bring it down because I'm very careful about that. But what it allows me to do is people end up talking to me, and then I'll engage in conversation, and I'm actually present in my life instead of constantly on my phone. I'm not soothing myself, and it creates detachment from others. You're plugged in instead of chatting. So that's why the coffee clutch, as I call it with the kids when they come home, that has become mandatory because I do not want them just buried in their phone. And we actually do that a lot. We do it on the weekends too, where we just make them sit around with us and talk with us. Okay, decrease in critical thinking and creativity. Here's another tip for you, and fun tips for your patients because they love them. But first, let me tell you what's happening. If you do not use these skills, critical thinking and creativity, if you don't use it, you lose it, or you never get it in the first place. If you're a young person and you're just used to, asking Siri. So there's a decrease in spatial skills because no longer are people thinking about where things are in space, and especially in their towns. So if you just think about using Google Maps, decrease in improvisation skills. So we have to learn how to improvise in our interactional style, and poor spelling and grammar. And so one thing that I tell people to do, and they love this, is to, if you forget something, do not ask Siri it. Try to remember it. And when you're trying to remember, like if you're trying to think of what actor it was, we saw Captain Marvel last night and we're like, who is that guy? And we're trying to remember his name. I could have easily looked it up on Siri. Honestly, I had to in the end because I could not think of his name. But it's Ben Mendelsohn, and you might know who he is. But we're like, what's that guy's name? My husband and I were thinking, and we're thinking, and we're thinking. But we tried for a really long time. Honestly, I never even knew his name. But we were thinking and thinking. And usually when we do it, one of us will come up with it. But all the thinking's like a workout for our critical thinking skills and for our memory skills. We're pulling it out. So in today's day and age, people are not thinking. They're just asking Alexa, and they're just asking Siri. And that's one of the most recent things that happened. I play music in the kitchen when I'm preparing food and that a lot, and I pick different playlists, and I didn't know the song, and I asked Alexa right away, and one of the kids said, oh, you're supposed to think of it instead of asking her, and I'm like, you're right. So the kids are catching on to this game too. Okay, depression. This is a cool study, and this is a big study. A study of 2,500 kids. So if you know anything about science, that's a lot of kids. Shows that there's increases in anxiety and depression with increased screen time. So this is just pivotal for kids. And I'm going to give you a tip at the end of this slide about how to incorporate this in practice, because I've learned a couple of things that didn't go so well. And then we'll wrap up because we're running out of time. But video games and computers are worse than TV. So when people ask you, are video games worse than video games and computers worse than TV? The answer is yes. So you want to be cognizant of that, and I'm going to give you a tip for it in just a second. But the brain gets caught in a negative feedback loop. Another thing is sedentary kids don't use exercise to offset the effects of screen time. So you've already heard me say that in my own life, I use this in my own life for myself. I run every day. People always ask me, are you a runner? No, but I run every day. And it's for my brain more so than anything, because I spend a lot of time sedentary in front of my computer. In the middle of the day, I get up, I get out into nature, into the world, and I drop out that frontal lobe by going for a run. And I do it every day, and I make my kids do it too. I make the kids take walks, I make them take runs, I make them get outside before they're allowed to go back on electronics after a school day, so that they are not just sedentary. Now, the thing that I wanted to tell you is that when I first opened my practice, I was really gung-ho about this, and when people joined me for care for neurofeedback, I would tell them this stuff and really encourage them not to let their kids, use a lot of screens. And what happened is the kids would rebel. I had a couple kids really freak out on their parents and refuse to do neurofeedback because it was associated with them not being able to use their screens. I found myself in all these family conversations trying to smooth that over. So I will tell you, I don't strongly tell parents what they should or shouldn't do. I tell them the guidelines that I'm going to tell you in just a second, but I tell them if they can balance screen use, it's going to help their neurofeedback outcomes. And that is true. So you have to be aware of that. Sleep problems. Sleep problems are worse than ever. And I've already told you that it's because the sleep-wake cycles are disrupted. It's proven by science. Melatonin production, which helps us shift into sleep, is reduced. So there's not enough to invoke and sustain sleep. And then at the same time, you have all that high data making it almost impossible to fall asleep. So it's creating sleep problems. And the important note I've already told you, if you have any of these brain patterns, you're more at risk from being impacted by screen time: anxiety, ADHD, depression, addictions, concussion, and memory problems. Okay, so you can read this. I've already told you this, 60 hertz is what we resonate. And what happens is reduced serotonin production from just being in life and needing the constant stimulation for serotonin production to be increased. And studies show that excessive gaming actually increased brain degeneration in the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is for executive function, planning, organization. It's for impulse control and judgment. And you may or may not know that the newest DSM now calls video game addiction an actual diagnostic category. So just remember, green is good on these types of brain maps where it is in the middle of the population. We want to see green maps, not red. We've already talked about the ADHD brain map and how it's impacted. So let's move on, because we're out of time, to what you can do to help. Moderation. That's number one. You want to encourage your patients to get a brain map and this is a fun way to get people to get brain maps, because you want them to find out how their brain is running, to let them know if they're at risk for electronic screen syndrome. And that's a really cool way to approach it, because they're on their electronics all the time. Are you at risk for being more impacted? And it really works with people. Also, you can give them lifestyle suggestions like I just told you. One thing is you can download a program on your computer called F.Lux, which switches the blue light to red light in the early morning and the evening hours. And I use it on my computer and I love it. Kids don't love it, I will tell you, but it's good for their brains anyway. And you can use your blue light filter glasses, which I wear them, not always when I'm recording webinars, but these are mine, and they're $20 on Amazon. And they filter the blue light so that the impact of the screens is less on my brain. So for $20, people can buy these glasses and can be in much better shape. So last slide, what does moderation look like? It is a limit of 2 hours per day of screen time. And that's based on the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendation. A lot of families that I work with, they cut down screen time during the week for younger kids to just about none, and for older kids to less than that, which I think is awesome. Now, on the weekends, what do we do about it? On the weekends, less than 2 hours at a time, especially if families that come into you have kids that are used to just gaming all the time. You can't take that away, or that family's not going to be coming back into you for very long, because their kiddo will have a meltdown. But 2 hours at a time, and it's recommended that the break is just as long as that. So usually I recommend double the amount of time for the break. So if they're on for 2 hours, they take a 4-hour break. So for my children, we try to do that where, you get a little bit of game time, but then you have to go engage in your life, and then in the evening you can spend time on electronics again. And of course, we have Screen-Free Week coming up in April. You want to encourage people to partake in that even for a day. Okay, so now we know electronic screen time is creating wired and tired brains, and it is wreaking havoc on our behavioral challenges that we're seeing with people, and we have a lot of problems that are being created, and we have the solution in neurofeedback. So what does neurofeedback do? It brings high beta down. It brings delta and theta down. It increases alpha and low beta. So we can reverse screen time effects by consistent use of neurofeedback by bringing these levels back down for people who do not have at-risk brain maps. For those with at-risk brain maps, we do the same thing, but we're able to bring that initial brain map pattern down, taking that risk level away. And then, how I feel about this is that basically we're offering a 3-step process through our Neurofeedback Expert offices. We want to be able to identify what people's brains are doing. We want to use neurofeedback to create regulation and a positive feedback loop of better brain functioning. And then we have to give people some tools so that they can keep their brain pattern there themselves. And that's what this webinar is designed to do. Okay, I hope that helps you out in thinking about screen time so that you can have an answer for everything when you're interacting with the families in your practice. I don't think we have any questions today, but if anybody has a question, please send it to my email. You can send it to drtrishleigh@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to answer any questions for you. And if not, go rock out the rest of an awesome week, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.